As I say, doing some amateur theatre, and we were doing an evening of Sondheim music, and a few of the other people in this amateur group with me were struggling with some of the songs. And me, with the incredible ego I had at that point, said to these lovely, lovely people who were in theatre for the love of it, I said, maybe you should give this one a miss because you're really not coping with it. And I look back on that moment now, just utterly ashamed of how I treated those people, the things I was saying to them. It's just an awful, awful memory. And you know how you have those moments you think, oh, if I could go back to a couple of moments in my life, that would be one of them. Well, that would be right near the top of my list. And people feel guilt about all sorts of things, but that has stayed with me. And I guess in some respects has shaped me as well, because I didn't like the way it made me feel. And as I say, this was a couple of years after when I remembered it and thought, oh, that was really, really ugly. So, of course, I try very hard to avoid doing anything like it again. So do you have something that eats away at you, something you've said and done, and you just can't let go of the guilt? And it might have been something you did at school, and that person may not even remember that you did it, but you remember that you did it or you said it. Is guilt something you feel you have far too much of in your life? I'd like you to meet Dr Rachel Hannam. Rachel is a psychologist from North Brisbane Psychologists. Good afternoon.
Hi, Kelly.
You must have many stories of the same, where people have those experiences just stored up inside them and there's really no way of making good.
In my work, one-on-one with people or with couples, yeah, I do. Eventually they get there. Eventually, once they've sort of talked about the presenting issue, they get to some of the older stuff, like your story.
Is guilt common?
Yeah, guilt is very common, and guilt can be a very healthy emotion. As you've just expressed, it can be very adaptive in that we can learn. We can reflect on our actions. The feelings, kind of encourage us to reflect like you did and make changes to our behaviour.
Is it an emotion we only feel in connection with our relationships with other people?
Yeah, it's guilt and other related emotions like shame and embarrassment, humiliation, remorse are all what are called social emotions. So they're emotions that we feel within a social context. So you can imagine a baby, who pulls the cat's tail, and instead of feeling guilty about that because they haven't yet learned about how it feels from the other side, they think it's kind of funny.
Yep.
But later in life, if you did that, you might feel guilty about it.
When does guilt become disruptive or harmful for the person who is feeling the guilt?
So to a point, it's healthy and adaptive because it does encourage us to make right, or to reflect and make changes in how we behave. When guilt doesn't do that, when we don't use it to reflect and potentially, make reparation or atonement for the thing we're now disappointed that we did, and we store it up, it can turn into shame. And when it turns into shame, it kind of goes underground. We're not as conscious of it anymore. We're not reflecting. We're not being deliberate about it, but we're more reactive. Shame is a deeper, more uncomfortable emotion. And instead of reflecting and making changes, we tend to act out when it comes to shame, and we might get aggressive or angry or blaming or withdraw or become a people-pleaser perfectionist.
And is that what happens when there are things that you're not coping with that you don't want to name and you don't want to face, is that it bobs up somewhere else as something else?
Yeah, it often can. When guilt turns into shame, it's a very intolerable emotion for most of us, so we immediately pull away from it, and it comes out in some other form.
Is denial also attached to guilt? If you've cheated in a relationship, for example, or done something socially that we don't talk about, are those sort of things that people would feel very guilty about?
I would say most people would experience some degree of guilt about that. I mean, unless they completely lack empathy and a regard for, other people's feelings or for social norms and rules, then, yeah, that would be a very common emotion. And you mentioned denial. The nature of denial is we don't know we're in denial, or we wouldn't be in denial. So it's an automatic disconnection from how we're feeling and from how we're feeling about what we've done, and therefore, not really facing what we've done.
Are some of us more guilt-prone than others? We'll feel guilty about a whole range of things that other people go, oh, no, give that up. Don't be feeling guilty about that anymore.
Sure. Yeah, I've read some research that says that shows that women are more guilt-prone than men. Mm-hmm. Gross generalisation, of course. I see many men in my practice who, are racked with, guilt and shame about some issues. But, certainly there's some gender differences there. And I think definitely in terms of temperament, some of us inherit a temperament, in our genetics, and we're probably naturally more sensitive, naturally more empathic, and naturally more, liable to feel guilt.
What happens if you feel no guilt? If you're someone, is there a name for that? Or how does it affect your ability to relate to other people?
Yeah, very interesting question, an interesting topic, and lots of debate and probably not clear consensus. But certainly there are people down the other end of the continuum from the sensitive empathic types who are much less likely to feel guilt. We in psychology, we have various terms to talk about those people, such as narcissism, sociopaths. They are folk who don't tend to experience as much empathy for other people and are much less likely to feel guilty. So an example might be, say you're meeting a friend for dinner and you've carelessly put your keys somewhere other than where you normally put them and you can't find them and you spend half an hour. Now, you and I might feel regret for having wasted all that time, as well as guilt for having our friend wait for us for half an hour. Mm-hmm. Whereas the sociopath will probably feel regret for wasting his time, but maybe not guilt because, his friend's disappointed and irritable.
Sometimes it might be nice. Could I just say?
Right,
to feel no guilt. I mean, I'm not on that end of the spectrum mostly, I think. But sometimes you do think to yourself, wow, to feel no guilt about anything, to breeze through the world, just not caring. I know it would have its drawbacks as well with relationships, but even then you don't care.
Well, I don't know, because I often say to highly sensitive clients, it's a blessing and a curse, isn't it? And they give me that knowing smile. It's a blessing and a curse. And it's a blessing and a curse in the other end as well. I think folk who don't naturally feel empathy and connect with others can also end up feeling quite lonely if they're honest.
With me this afternoon, Dr Rachel Hannam, a psychologist from North Brisbane Psychologists, and we're talking about guilt this afternoon on ABC Local Radio Queensland. Where do you then begin to start when someone comes to you and whatever issues they're having are rooted in the guilt and shame that they're feeling about whatever it is that's happened in their life? How do you begin to ease that situation and draw them out of it?
Well, I guess we want to get some clarity about, exactly what have been the triggers in the present and the past for guilt and shame. So once we have some clarity about the reality, we can differentiate between what actually happened and then what they're telling themselves about what happened, their own interpretation of what they, did. And so then we're getting more to the core beliefs that they have about themselves. I'm a bad person. I'm not good enough. There's something wrong with me. I'm defective, And then we can begin to bring some compassion and empathy to the self and, start to soften some of those really unhelpful core beliefs. So, that can take a while for some people.
Oh, I imagine if you've been negative talking yourself for 30 years about whatever had happened with your parents, for example, or a sibling, those deep relationships that you can't just go, right, I'm breaking up with you and I'll just put that in the over there box, with people you really do have to be involved with your entire life. That could be very tricky, I imagine.
Yeah. And I have one of my favourite sayings is the past echoes into the present. So although I'm mainly working with people in the present, we're looking at how the present interactions and life circumstances are triggering guilt and shame, which, is probably related to something from the past. And, it's helpful to make those connections so that they can see, the feelings of shame particularly are not really helping them at all. And if there's any guilt left over, if there's any disappointment in their own actions in the current situation, then that's helpful to know. They can reflect and learn. But there's some interesting research that shows shame shuts down the learning centres of our brain. So
really?
When we've got a lot of shame, we aren't capable of learning. We aren't capable of reflecting and changing, whereas guilt doesn't shut down the learning centres of the brain. So in that way, it's a healthier, more adaptive emotion.
What's the difference then between guilt and shame?
Well, I guess, there's a lot written about that, but a really simple way of saying it is guilt says, I've done something wrong, and shame says there's something wrong with me. So one is about behaviour or actions, and one is about the self.
Are most people aware that they're thinking differently then about their emotions and where their emotions sort of stand in the spectrum?
I would say mostly not. And so, when they come to see me, my work is to help them become more conscious of what they are thinking and what those emotions feel like, and so they can differentiate between, say, shame and guilt.
So what do you tell people who are feeling guilt about? I mean, I suppose you can't tell people how to feel about anything, really. They'll feel how they feel. But what sort of language do they need to start using and thinking to start to deal with it?
Well, probably lots of different things, but the first one that comes to mind is, I'll ask them to tell me how they feel about what they did, if it's a particular situation. And it's helpful sometimes just to realise that they feel disappointed about what they did, and that on reflection they wish they would have done it differently, like in your story. They wish they would have handled a situation differently. That's very healthy, to allow ourselves to feel some sadness or disappointment about our own actions, because, that's how we learn. Whereas if they think I'm just a terrible person for having done that, then we need to look at where that's coming from and various ways to start to, change that internal dialogue that's been happening for so long about who they are.
What then about the perfectionist? How are they influenced by their own feelings of needing for everything to be exactly right, and somehow they're a failure if they're not living up to standards that they certainly don't usually have for everybody else as well?
Well, I mean, we know now from the research that shame is at the heart of perfectionism, more so than guilt, and it's one of the directions that shame can take is the perfectionistic, people-pleasing kind of coping strategy. Yeah, and that sort of says, I have to be perfect. I can't be human. I have to be perfect. I have to have everybody like me all of the time. And, it's one of the coping strategies as a defence against shame.
In your practice, have you found that men and women talk about guilt and shame differently or in a similar way?
Yeah, great question. I'd say there's much more variation between, from one individual to the next than between the genders. Yeah. But I guess in line with that research I spoke about, I do sense that women tend to experience more guilt than men, and perhaps it's because they tend to be a little higher on natural empathy and sympathy. But in terms of shame, I haven't actually noticed any difference. I think if we've heard a lot of shaming messages in our childhood from parents, teachers, others growing up, then all human beings, can easily internalise these messages.
Psychologist Rachel Hannam talking about our various personal reactions to guilt and shame. So hopefully a bit of food for thought in there for you on our reactions.